Today I'm going to be reviewing 5 different dry foods that were submitted by followers on my Instagram to see which ones are most appropriate for an active dog versus an inactive dog, and kind of giving you my thoughts on the subject. Now before we get started, if you're not familiar with me, hi, my name is Nikki. I'm a registered veterinary technician with a diploma in companion animal nutrition, and today we're going to be talking about dog food. Now if dog food and canine nutrition is something that interests you, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want me to review a different brand in the future than the ones we're mentioning today, go ahead and leave a comment below with that brand and I'll go ahead and put it on my list. Now, how exactly am I going to be reviewing these diets? I'm not going to be giving you guys like a 5-star rating or something like that. I'm actually just going to be going through different types of topics, and I'm going to give you information so that you can make your own decisions. So there's 3 different areas that I'm going to kind of be going over. First, I'm going to be looking at the overall composition of these diets, and this is to basically get an idea of what kind of dog these diets would be most appropriate for, if they're good for an active dog, an endurance athlete, or more for a dog that requires a lower amount of calories in order to maintain a healthy weight. Now, in order to know the compositions of these different diets, I can't just look at the guaranteed analysis. I actually need to convert the guaranteed analysis to what's called a nutrient density. The reason for this is because the guaranteed analysis is influenced by 2 different factors: the moisture content of the food and also the caloric density of the food. So in order to account for those 2 things, I take the guaranteed analysis, I convert it over to a nutrient density, and then I can accurately compare the composition on grams per 1,000 kcals between different foods. If you are looking to get this information, the easiest way to actually get it is to contact the company directly and ask for what's called a typical analysis. Then you can look at the protein, fat, and carbohydrates per 1,000 kcals, along with different supplements and vitamins and minerals. Now, if you don't want to contact the company directly and you just want to quickly look at a guaranteed analysis to compare multiple foods, kind of like what I'm doing today, I do have an Excel spreadsheet that does that calculation for you. I will go ahead and link that below. Now, the second thing that I'm going to be doing is looking at the ingredients list along with the different nutraceuticals that are being offered within the diet to, 1, see what type of supplementation is used within the diet, and 2, see if those nutraceuticals like fish oils and maybe joint supplements are actually at therapeutic levels where they would be appropriate for an active dog. The third thing that I'm going to be doing with each of these companies is breaking down the company as a whole. So I'm going to be looking at something called the WSAVA questions, which are a set of questions that basically ask things about formulation expertise, quality control, and research surrounding the diets. So if you want to know what the WSAVA questions are, I'll go ahead and link those below as well, along with some other useful resources. So let's go ahead and get started. For our active dogs, this is kind of what we're looking for. We're looking for a diet that is on the moderate to higher amount of fat, because fat is going to be the primary fuel source for our more active dogs. We also want a good amount, kind of moderate amount of carbohydrates, because the first portion of activity, really that first hour, is mostly fueled by carbohydrate metabolism, not fat metabolism. Then once we get towards that second hour and beyond, we start to switch over to primarily using fat as our fuel source. Now, I did go over this in a lot of detail in my previous video, and I'll go ahead and link that above, talking about the nutritional needs of more active dogs. So if you want more info on that, go ahead and check that out. The first diet that we're going to be looking at today is going to be the Farmina ancestral grain chicken and pomegranate adult, medium, and maxi recipe. Now, if you see me looking down a lot, that's because I have my computer here so that I can look at all the numbers on these diets. So the first thing that I did with this diet is take that guaranteed analysis and convert it to that nutrient density, so grams per 1,000 kcals, so I can kind of compare more accurately. This diet is what I would consider moderate across the board, so we're looking at like 79 grams per 1,000 kcals as far as protein, about 48 grams per 1,000 kcals for fat, and about 86 grams per 1,000 kcals as far as carbohydrates.
So with this composition, this diet would really be more appropriate for a more active dog, getting between 30 minutes to 2 hours of activity. We don't really see it as being good for dogs that are more highly active in those endurance categories, just because of the amount of protein with this recipe. It would be difficult to probably maintain a healthy weight when we get into endurance activities. For dogs that are less active, this diet is probably too calorically dense in order to help them maintain a healthy weight. So it's kind of in the middle range as far far as activity level and being appropriate.
So in order to further evaluate this diet, so kind of take it to the next level beyond just general recommendations,
I wanted to do some calculations for you guys to see if the amount of supplementation added to these diets for nutraceuticals like fish oil, which contains EPA and DHA, and joint supplementation was actually efficient for an active dog based on the amount fed.
this dog is getting enough EPA and DHA from the diet alone where there would be no need for additional supplementation of fish oil if your dog is healthy. Also, if your active dog was consuming this diet has a declared amount of glucosamine conjoined within the diet where additional supplementation would not be necessary. Now, I will say that bioavailability of glucosamine conjoined does vary quite a bit between supplements, so additional supplementation for therapeutic purposes of either fish oil or glucosamine conjoined, you should probably discuss it with your vet. However, as written on the label, this one's good on both of those categories, which is pretty cool. Now, when I look at the ingredients list, there's a couple of things of notes that I see within this panel. First, I do see the use of some prebiotic fibers. These are things like inulin, silent husk, frugosaccharides. These things are really beneficial to the microbiome. However, just like with people where some people tolerate fiber supplements better than others, the same thing kind of happens with dogs. The other thing that I saw within this recipe that I liked is the use of chelated minerals. So chelated minerals are basically the mineral attached to a protein, and by doing this, it makes them more bioavailable for our dogs. So this recipe is using chelated minerals as the supplementation, which is again really great because they're more bioavailable than things like sulfides and oxides. The other thing that I think is cool is they do have a variety of fruits and vegetables added to this diet. Now, I will say just because a kibble or dry food contains fruits and vegetables on the label does not generally make me recommend not giving fruits and vegetables as treats, because we really don't know how much of the powerful like antioxidants and phytonutrients that are within these fruits and vegetables are still there at the end of processing. So I would still definitely give those blueberries as treats. I think that they're a great option. Another thing that I really like about this formula is that it is an adult maintenance formula, which means that it's made for an adult and not a puppy. For our adults, probably not that big of a deal to have an all life stage formula that is appropriate for puppies, but once we start to get to the later years of adulthood or into the senior years, we really want to go into an adult formula just because the amount of phosphorus within that recipe is going to be lower, along with a lot of the other minerals, since we aren't trying to sustain growth but instead maintenance. So it's just going to relieve some pressure from those vital organs within our bodies that, you know, we're starting to age. Now, looking at the company as a whole, they do have both PhDs and masters in animal nutritionists on staff. They have veterinarians on staff. They honestly have a wide variety of professionals on staff. Farmina is actually a fairly large pet food brand in Europe, so this company actually has a pretty good base as far as expertise on staff. As far as research goes, they have performed some in-house feeding trials on their diets that have included both short-term and long-term studies. However, they haven't done any AFCO feeding trials, and this is likely because it's a European brand, which means they fall under FEDIAF, which is a different regulatory body, rather than AFCO. They are importing or exporting their diets to the US, so they're not primarily based in the US as a dog food company, but they have done in-house digestibility trials, and then they have actually done longer term feeding trials as well. They do have really high quality control standards. They do test and hold for pathogens, toxins, molds, all that kind of jazz, which is great. They do own their own manufacturing facilities, and they have like chemists, food technologists, and quality control staff on site. And if you do ask them, they can provide a full typical analysis. Overall, when I look at using Farmina for a more active dog, I do think that it's a really good option. I like the fact that they have expertise on staff. I like their quality control standards. I think the macros are appropriate for an active dog and all that good stuff. Like I said, the only thing I'd really consider adding to this diet is really just some fruits and vegetables as treats for those antioxidants, but otherwise I think this is a really good option. All right, so the second recipe that we're going to be going through today is the Nulo Ancient Grains Adult Turkey, Trout, and Spelt recipe. After we convert the guaranteed analysis over to nutrient density here, we do see that the overall nutrient profile is very similar to Farmina, but with two key differences. First, the amount of fiber. The Nulo recipe is almost twice the amount of fiber as the Farmina recipe was. And it also has 10 more grams of carbohydrates, which kind of makes sense given the added fiber. Now, for active dogs, we typically don't want diets that are higher in fiber. The main reason for this is as our dogs are moving more, it actually will speed up their GI tract, and insoluble fiber in particular, which is what you see on the crude fiber on the guaranteed analysis, that is going to actually speed up passage of stools. Now, couple that with the speeding up of the GI tract because of activity, you could potentially actually cause loose stools by having an active dog on a higher fiber diet. But this will really be a case-by-case basis. Some dogs will actually just do better on a higher fiber diet, but it's not most active dogs in particular on this case. But overall, since this recipe is more moderate in protein, fat, and carbohydrates, and we see an overall higher caloric density per volume fed, I would say that this is probably a recipe that's appropriate on a macronutrient standpoint to a more active dog that's getting between 30 minutes to 2 hours of activity per day. Now, I don't think that I mentioned this with Farmina, but it kind of applies to both of these recipes in the sense that the protein content within both the Farmina and the Nulo is actually so high that it wouldn't be actually appropriate for our endurance athletes. And that's because protein is a really poor energy source. And because there's so much protein per calorie fed within these diets, dogs may struggle to actually maintain a healthy weight if they're endurance athletes on these recipes. They actually, for an endurance athlete, would need overall distribution of calories per 1,000 kcals. They'd need lower amounts of protein and much higher amounts of fat, and then restricted amounts of carbohydrates. So a little bit different composition here. So I wouldn't recommend this necessarily to an endurance athlete for either the Farmina or the Nulo. Now, I do want to caution about caloric restriction on these diets or feeding close to resting energy requirements. This diet isn't appropriate for lower amounts of calories fed, especially to a senior dog where our protein needs are higher. So we would want to feed this diet with caution to a dog that is fed lower amounts of calories, either due to need for weight loss or just weight maintenance at lower calories fed. Now, looking at some of the specifics of this recipe and the ingredients. We see a mixture of chelated and non-chelated minerals, so kind of the combination of kind of some oxides and sulfates, and then these chelated minerals that are more bioavailable, which they might be doing in order to bring down costs because those non-chelated minerals tend to be a little bit less expensive. And again, I like seeing that this is an adult maintenance formula rather than in a life stage or puppy formula, just because as we get to those later years of adulthood into the senior years, I like seeing the mineral content to be a little bit more moderate so we don't put undue stress on some of our organs like our kidney or our liver. Now, I don't see any joint support within this recipe. I don't see any declared amounts or it on the ingredients list. I do see some added purified fiber sources, which makes sense because we do see that higher amount of fiber on the label. The one thing that I do want to note is though on the guaranteed analysis, it says that there is a declared amount of total omega-3s. It doesn't actually specify whether those omega-3s are ALA, EPA, or DHA. The reason why this matters is because ALA is actually not that bioavailable for dogs. Depending on the research study you read, only about 1 to 10% of ALA can actually be converted over to the bioavailable form, which is EPA and DHA. But when I actually look at the ingredients here, I do see two different sources of omega-3s. I see flaxseed and I see trout. By weight, the flaxseed is higher up on the ingredients list than the trout, and I don't see any purified fish oil on there. So I don't know if all of those omega-3s listed are ALA or EPA and DHA, so there's no way for me to actually make an estimate to if there is adequate amounts within this diet. There is a guaranteed amount of probiotics within this diet, which is kind of a cool nutraceutical. It may be beneficial for an active dog just because they do have those issues with kind of looser stools. Adding in a probiotic maybe might combat that a little bit. We also do see some dried fruits and vegetables, but similar to kind of the Farmina recipe, I probably wouldn't omit giving fruits and vegetables just because it's on an ingredient panel, just because when it's processed into a kibble, I really don't know how much of those antioxidants and phytonutrients are still bioavailable within that diet for the company as a whole. They do employ a full-time nutritionist with a PhD in animal nutrition, which is great, that handles their diet formulation. I don't see any mention of any type of research as far as feeding trails or digestibility trails or anything like that. I also looked on their website a whole bunch and tried to find if they have any type of quality control standards that I can find, and I didn't see any mention of quality control standards on their website at all, other than maybe some comments by the company mentioning that they get a certificate of analysis from ingredient suppliers, and that they may be testing for heavy metals within their fish ingredients. But because that wasn't really mentioned, I can't really comment too much on that. I do know that they use a co-packing facility and that they don't own their own facility. I also know that the typical analysis, when I looked online, it is available, which I always like. Personally, when I look at this company as a whole and kind of some of their marketing, I see in their marketing that they're demonizing and blaming carbohydrates for a lot of stuff. Inflammation, joint disease, obesity, but we really don't have any research to back it up. They don't cite any research to back it up. And honestly, their diets aren't carbohydrate restrictive anyway. So it seems kind of weird. So overall, Nulo is a newer company. So they were founded in like 2010. And as a new company, I do understand that it might be difficult to invest in like a whole entire manufacturing facility. However, I kind of do expect some things to happen over like 13 years. Like I would hope that one, we have a really good handle on quality control procedures and have those kind of listed and be proud of them online. The other thing is that I would expect to at least have digestibility trials done at this point. There are other companies that did digestibility trials within 10 years of launching. So I don't feel like it's out of the realm of possibility in order to do that. I think it's really important to know those numbers. And though it is possible that the reason why they can't mention quality control procedures is because their co-packing facility doesn't allow them to, I still personally wouldn't feel comfortable feeding a diet that can't provide this transparency, because I think that it's really important. So that's just my opinion on this particular diet. So the next diet we're going to be looking at today is going to be the Sunday's beef recipe. So when we look at the Sunday's beef recipe in comparison to Farmina and Nulo, we do see some key differences. First is going to be the distribution of calories and the macronutrient profile. So we see that the protein is kind of on the lower side of moderate here, and then our fat is going to be higher, and then our carbohydrates are actually fairly restrictive. So you're looking at 66 grams per 1,000 kcals of protein, 47 grams per 1,000 kcals as fat, and then 30 grams per 1,000 kcals of carbohydrates. So this would be a low moderate protein, high moderate fat, and then low carbohydrate diet. So with the caloric density being really high here, above 5,000 kcals per kg, where the other diets were around 4,000 kcals per kg, this diet is definitely made for the more moderate to highly active dog, and potentially even into some of those more endurance athletes, given the lower amount of carbohydrates and then the higher amount of fat here. Now, the issue with this food potentially is that because this diet is so low in nutrient density, it's really not appropriate for dogs that maybe need weight loss or that need a lower amount of calories in order to maintain a healthy weight. It also might not be appropriate for a lot of senior dogs. Also, this is an all life stage formula, meaning that it's appropriate for both puppies and adults. Personally, I don't like feeding all life stage formulas as a primary diet when we start to get to the later adult years or into our senior years, just because there's going to be naturally a higher amount of minerals within those diets because of the amount of minerals you need to sustain growth in a puppy, and you don't need that in a senior dog. So that's not ideal when we get into our later years. Now, similar to Nulo, Sundays also doesn't have a declared amount of EPA and DHA on the guaranteed analysis. They do have a declared amount of omega-3 fatty acids. Now, this will make it very difficult in order to actually estimate the total amount of EPA and DHA within this diet, especially since this diet does also contain flax seeds, which are a source of ALA. So there's no way to really know if we're meeting our omega-3 fatty acid needs here as far as for EPA and DHA to help with that inflammation. Now, when you check out the ingredients panel, basically you're not seeing a lot of added supplementation to this recipe, or you see very minimal amounts of added vitamins and minerals. And when you see those vitamins and minerals added, they are the chelated or the most bioavailable bioavailable form of those vitamins and minerals. They're instead basically focusing on the use of whole foods rather than supplements in order to make this a complete and balanced diet. There are a lot of mentions of fruits and vegetables within this diet, which again, I love seeing, but when we look at the salt within the ingredient panel, so salt isn't allowed to be more than 1% of the diet. So most of the fruits and vegetables within this diet fall below salt. So it is possible that they don't make up like a huge majority of this diet. So I probably would still, again, not omit giving fruits and vegetables as treats for those antioxidants and phytonutrients. I don't see any added joint supplementation here, but I do see the use of some herbs and fibers. So chicory root, I see parsley, turmeric, ginger. These are all kind of nice bonuses to have in there because they do have some anti-inflammatory properties, but it wouldn't be something that I would consider therapeutic. It's just kind of nice to have. The company as a whole, they do consult with a board certified veterinary nutritionist and a PhD animal nutritionist for formulation. They do have veterinarians on staff though, which are the founders of this recipe. They don't have any AFCO feeding trails or digestibility trails on their diets. I know at one point they were talking about maybe doing some digestibility trails, so I'd like to see those when they come out, which would be cool. They do have really high quality control standards here, so they have a test and hold for pathogens. They test for molds and toxins, so things like mycotoxins, aflatoxins, and all that jazz. They don't manufacture their own foods, but they are using a human grade facility in order to manufacture their foods, which does give a little bit potentially higher quality control standards as far as ingredient sourcing and stuff like that. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's higher than someone else, but the base standards is a little bit higher. Full typical analysis is available upon request for this company. Now, overall, this company is actually really new, so 2018, so we're still at like the 5-year mark for this company, and because of that, I don't really mind that they're using a co-packing facility. I think that it's pretty reasonable given the amount of funding that you sometimes need in order to actually have your own manufacturing facility. They also have really high quality control standards that they're very upfront about, that they have for their food, which I like to see. However, I'd really like to see those digestibility trials come out soon. That's something that I like seeing with foods because it gives me that added kind of peace of mind knowing that the bioavailability is what they thought or the formulation is as they thought it would be digested in an actual dog rather than just on paper. So next food we're going to be talking about is going to be the Royal Canin large breed dog food. It's also called Maxi depending on where you are in the world. This diet is formulated for large breed dogs, and it has a moderate amount of protein and fat and higher amounts of carbohydrates. Looking at the distribution of calories here, I see a moderately low amount of protein at 68 grams per 1,000 kcals, kind of a moderate amount of fat at 43 grams per 1,000 kcals, and then a moderate amount of carbohydrate at right above 110 grams per 1,000 kcals. So overall composition, I kind of put this towards the lower end of activity, maybe 30 minutes to an hour, just because we do have that low moderate amount of protein, and then we have that higher amount of carbohydrates. And carbohydrates in that beginning of activity of 30 minutes to an hour is usually our primary fuel source, and then we switch to fat. And this recipe is kind of moderate in fats, like almost 40 grams. So I would say that that would be most appropriate here. The other thing that kind of makes me go towards that range is the caloric density. So caloric density here is only 360 kcals per cup. In comparison to the other diets, you were looking at like 400 to 500 kcals per cup. So a lot more calorically dense. You're just gonna have to feed more of this food in order to satisfy calorie needs for a more active dog. So I think kind of that lower range of activity of 30 minutes to an hour is likely most appropriate for this recipe. I think it's really important to understand though is though I'm saying 30 minutes to an hour of activity, that doesn't mean that your dog's eating a really low and restrictive amount of calories. Dog is still going to be eating a moderate amount of calories. So RER times 1.6. Once you start to taper towards that RER by itself, so something where your dog might be struggling with weight maintenance, this diet is probably not appropriate because your dog's protein needs aren't going to be met at that lower amount of calories, given that we only have 66 grams per 1,000 kcals within this diet. So I probably wouldn't be jumping on this diet for a dog that needs caloric restriction in any way, shape, or form. The other thing that I would probably be shying away as far as this diet is that it's probably not super appropriate for a senior dog. Now, given that this isn't a senior dog food and Royal Canin has a very large range of foods, including senior large breed dog foods, I probably wouldn't be reaching for this as well. For seniors, I'd probably be looking for something a little bit more specific, just because, again, that protein content is a little bit lower. Given a senior might need slightly lower amount of calories than it was as an adult dog, you might see some muscle loss potentially when feeding this diet, especially at lower amounts of calories for a senior dog that has higher protein needs as well. When I look at the ingredients panel by itself into like the supplementation and stuff, I do see kind of a combination of both chelated and non-chelated minerals, similar to kind of the Nulo, which will vary in bioavailability. I really like seeing just the chelated minerals or the really highly bioavailable minerals within our recipes. I do like that this is an adult only formula, which is great, instead of a puppy formula, just because it's more appropriate for that life stage. As far as supplementation, I do see some fiber being supplemented in here, and we do have a fiber content that's about 4% dry matter. Now, as far as our highly active dogs go, the 4% might be a bit much, but if we're looking at the lower range of activity, this might be more appropriate for that range, so it might be fine. It really is going to be individual to the dog. Sometimes I like looking at things closer to like 2% as far as our crude fiber dry matter, just so that we make sure that that stool is really compact and it can potentially slow down that passage of stools through the GI tract. Now, this recipe does have a declared amount of EPA and DHA plus joint supplementation, which I think is great. But when I look at the amount fed, I really don't see the amount of EPA and DHA added to this diet that would help with like generalized inflammation as far as the dosing. And I also don't see quite enough of that glucosamine conjoint and really to help with joint disease. So for me, I'd be looking at something for an active dog that has a little bit more of that supplementation. You either add it on or choose a different diet entirely. There's also no fruits and vegetables added to this diet, so I'd probably want to add some in as treats. Honestly, we have some pretty cool research looking at active dogs fed just like 1 to 2% of their diet is like blueberries, having potential antioxidant benefits. So definitely something to look into if you do have an active dog. Maybe you want to add in some fruit. Company as a whole, honestly, Royal Canin is a huge company, right? So they have multiple board certified veterinary nutritionists, PhD, animal nutritionists, biochemists, food scientists, and stuff on staff. They have a lot of formulation expertise at their disposal. They do have some AFCO feeding trails, and they do have digestibility trails on their foods. Again, similar to Farmina, this is not a US brand. This is a brand that's from Europe. So they really only have chosen to do AFCO specific feeding trails for particular diets within their line. They haven't done them on all of them just because they are actually, as a company, under FEDIAF, not AFCO. They do have really high quality control standards. Honestly, if you want to see what high quality control standards look like, ask them for their Wasava PDF. It's like a 22-page document that goes through all the different things and the steps that they take as far as quality control to make sure their diets come out well. So I think that that's a really cool thing if you want to go find that for yourself and request it from the company. They do manufacture their own foods, and they do have a full typical analysis upon request. Now, overall, if I'm looking to feed this diet to an active dog, I probably wouldn't. Royal Canin has such a large line, and they have so many subcategories of companies that this isn't the best choice as far as a diet for an active dog. You would probably want to look at something like Eukanuba, which is the same Royal Canin brand, but it's an active dog line, which would have the joint supplementation, the fish oil, and the more appropriate macronutrients for an active dog. So this just isn't the appropriate diet really for an active dog. All right, so our last recipe for today is kind of a more budget friendly option. This is the Iams active chicken and turkey dog food. So if we look at the distribution of calories here, we see a higher amount of protein, high moderate amount of fat, and then a moderate amount of carbohydrates, which honestly would be more appropriate for an active dog. So dogs that get probably between 30 minutes to 2 hours of activity, same kind of as the other diets like Farmina and Nulo, where I was like, oh, well, they're good for active dogs, but not endurance athletes. The amount of protein within this recipe is a little bit high for our really long endurance athletes. We'd really want that higher amount of fat content and then lower amounts of protein and carbohydrates as far as overall distribution, because we're going to meet our protein needs pretty easily just by calories fed for those endurance dogs. The one thing about this diet that I do think is, again, not as great probably is the higher amount of fiber. Like I've said before, this could potentially lead to a looser stool in an active dog just because their GI motility is already faster. You couple that with added insoluble fiber, which is going to speed things up. You could end up with a mess. But some dogs do really well with higher amounts of fiber within their diet, so it is possible your dog could do great on this. It's really going to be on an individual basis. Caloric density of this diet is good. We're looking at 400 kcals per cup, which should help with weight maintenance of an active dog. But on a flip side, this diet is really made for a more active dog. It's not meant for a dog that is looking to have weight maintenance, struggling to maintain their weight, that needs a lower amount of calories in order to maintain their weight. You're going to have issues with meeting protein needs. You're going to have issues maintaining weight because of caloric density. This is not a diet for those kind of dogs. Now, similar to our other diets, this one is made for adult weight maintenance, which I like seeing because I think that that's more appropriate when we get to our later adult years and into our senior years in order to not put those extra strain on our kidneys and our liver. Looking at the ingredients panel, I do see non-chelated minerals as far as supplementation, which means that they're going to be less bioavailable, which likely is just a cost-based decision. This is a low-cost food. They're trying to cut costs. That is one of the ways that you can do that. This is where formulation expertise really comes into play. So you can use things like oxides and sulfates or these less bioavailable mineral supplements. However, you're going to have to compensate for the fact that they are less bioavailable. So you need someone that really knows what they're doing as far as bioavailability to the dog and potentially some feeding trials on stock so that you really know if this diet is supplying what it needs to. So Joe Schmo really can't formulate a diet using these less bioavailable ingredients. It's not easy. The next thing I notice on the ingredient panel is caramel coloring. I don't like seeing caramel coloring or any type of coloring in pet food. Honestly, the coloring is there for the pet owners. It's not there for your dog. Your dog does not care if the kibble is caramel colored or not. It's just to make it more appealing for us. So I'm not a huge fan of that. And it doesn't provide any nutritional benefit to the dog at all. I do see some added fish oil to this recipe, which I like, but I don't see a declared amount of EPA and DHAs. It's really hard for me to do any calculations to see if the dosing is appropriate for inflammation and thus an active dog. I don't see any joint supplementation either, and I also don't see any added fruits or vegetables. This honestly might be a cost decision as well in order to keep costs down within this kibble, but that's something that you might want to consider adding back in some berries or leftover fruits and veggies as far as a preventative for either oxidative stress or adding in a joint supplement. As far as the company as a whole, it's important to understand that Iams is actually owned by Mars, which owns Royal Canin, which means that Iams has access to all the things that Royal Canin does as far as at a distance. So they do have access to those multiple board certified veterinary nutritionists, the PhDs, the masters in animal nutrition. They have access to those biochemists and the food scientists and all that stuff that's on staff at Royal Canin on a consulting basis. So their formulation on expertise is probably on point. So the fact that there's less bioavailable, maybe minerals and stuff like that, they've probably accounted for that really well within this recipe. We do have some digestibility trials within the Iams brand. We also do see select foods that have feeding trials, but not all of them. They do have pretty high quality control standards, even though they're maybe using more cost-effective foods and supplementation within their recipes, which is great. They have a test and hold for pathogens. They test for mycotoxins, aflatoxins. They do manufacture their own foods, which is also great, and they do have a typical analysis available upon request. So overall, my thoughts on this is that it's a really good budget-friendly option for an active dog. So if you do have an active dog and you need something that's more budget-friendly, this Iams active dog food may be a really good option. Next week, I'm going to be going through 5 different fresh fruit brands to see if they're appropriate for active dogs and kind of give you my thoughts on them. If you have any future recipes or dog foods that you want me to review, go ahead and leave a comment below, and make sure to check the links below for different resources like the calculators and the links to calculators and informational articles that I have there because they might be beneficial to you. See you next week.